As most of you know, the Common Core State Standards initiative was designed to provide clear and consistent and challenging standards for all students across the nation. They're voluntary state standards. 43 states and territories have signed on to them, and as you may know, in July 2010, the Massachusetts State Board of Education also voted to endorse and embrace the Common Core State Standards. You may also know that Massachusetts was very influential in the development of the standards. Many people in this room reviewed drafts, advocated for things that we thought were important, and because of Massachusetts's strong academic history, we had a lot of influence in how the standards eventually turned out. The goal of this morning's meeting is to get the perspective from a number of districts, schools, and classrooms about how the new standards are beginning to be implemented in Massachusetts, and to discuss the plans for assessing the standards, which is going to be a very important part of seeing that these have an impact on what our kids learn and their preparation for college and the workplace. We don't expect we'll be able to answer every question. There's a lot, and we're really very much at the beginning of this process, but we do hope that everybody will leave a little bit better informed. I'm certainly hoping to. And we also invite you to attend our next two events, which are described in your packets, which will provide more detail on other aspects of the standards. We are very pleased to have with us today, this morning, Jeffrey Nellhause, Deputy Commissioner at the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, who has been closely involved with the adoption and implementation of the new standards and is a leader in the development of new state assessments. Jeff will briefly discuss the implications for local curriculum and instruction, and will provide an overview of the challenges in MCAS that can be expected over the next few years as we move to adoption of the new standards. After Jeff, we'll hear from a panel of educators who are beginning to implement the standards across districts and schools and in classrooms. The panel will be moderated by Beth Gamzee of Apt Associates, who will also moderate discussion with the audience. We encourage all of you to be thinking of questions for the panel, and we look forward to an active discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jeff Nellhause, Deputy Commissioner for the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. He is a hero of assessment. He is passionate about assessment. He thinks this may strike others as a little bit strange, but we're grateful for it. He told me he's been at the department for 25 years, and during all that time in various roles as Director of Assessment, as Acting Commissioner, as Deputy Commissioner, Jeff has helped to keep Massachusetts education reform on track, and we're very grateful to have had him with us and leading us for all these years. Jeff Nellhause.
Thank you very much, Penny, and we're lucky to have someone like Penny Noyce also, who's been so supportive of education reform in Massachusetts over the years. So, Penny, hats off to you for sticking with us as well. As Penny said, my job today is to help people understand. I'm going to give you a little background on the Common Core State Standards, actually on our new Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, which incorporate the Common Core Standards. So it's not just about the Common Core Standards. I want to give you a little background about the development, the intent of those standards, a little bit about the development process, the adoption process, but then go into what does this mean for curriculum and instruction? What's the timeline? What are the state supports? What are we going to do about MCAS? Because everyone knows that seems to be an important question. Certainly don't want to test students on material they haven't been exposed to. So this element of fairness has to be built into this transition. So those are some of the topics I'll be going over. And I have the obligatory PowerPoint presentation here to kind of walk through all of this. Just went over that. This is the timeline, and Penny said, in adopting these new standards was not a simple process. In fact, we had been developing and revising our own state standards for about a year or two as the Common Core initiative was moving forward. And those two initiatives were running in parallel, if you will. And it was a good thing because we were able to inform the development of the Common Core standards because, in fact, we were revising our own at the same time and could, share that understanding. What was it about our current standards that needed revision? How could we see that play out in the Common Core standards? So it provided us an opportunity to work very closely with the writers of the Common Core standards and provide that feedback. And there are a number of individuals in this room who we, not only people in the Department of Education, but local educators who helped us provide feedback to the Common Core writing staff. And I know Doug Hawley from Hingham High School, right, Doug? He, mathematics department head there. Diane Kelly, who's going to be on the panel here. Barbara Libby from the Department of Education staff, who I think is in the audience. There are probably others here who worked tirelessly with us over you can see that from the summer of '09 to the spring of 2010 when we were providing feedback to the writers. Once the Common Core standards were completed, when was that, in the June of 2010, the question still remained, were they as strong, as rigorous as our own revised standards? And to help understand that, we actually conducted several studies. One study was commissioned by the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, and they basically contracted with a company called WestEd that did a comparative analysis. We also put together a committee of local practitioners and had them compare our revised standards to the Common Core standards. And both of those groups came up with a very common finding, and that was that the Common Core standards were as strong, if not stronger, than our own standards. And understandably, we had a national effort that went into developing the Common Core. The best minds in the country, higher education faculty. We used the research from other countries. There was a lot of good professional development that went into the development of the Common Core. And I will say that as I've been working with them over the past several months more closely, I'm beginning to appreciate more and more every day how well constructed the Common Core standards are. So I just want to share that I think we have a good set of standards that's going to take us to the next level in education reform, the next, if you will, drive the next 10 or 20 years of education in the Commonwealth. So, the board adopted first the Common Core standards, and then they adopted the standards with the proviso that we look to see if anything needs to be added. And the Common Core only went K to 12, so right off the bat we had to look at our pre-kindergarten standards. Our frameworks always included pre-kindergarten standards, so that was one thing that we reviewed and actually updated our pre-kindergarten standards. There are other elements from our former curriculum frameworks, guiding principles and reading, the author lists and other components that we brought into the Common Core and developed our new Massachusetts curriculum frameworks, which were adopted by the board in December of 2010. So this little arrow here gives you a little synopsis of the whole process that we went through to adopt these new curriculum frameworks. I want to say one thing about the new frameworks and the Common Core standards. They were developed with the explicit intent of defining the knowledge and skills students need to master in order to be college and career ready by the end of high school, and also define those standards that build towards that college and career ready standard. Now that might seem kind of obvious, but this was not the intent, the general explicit intent of the development of our first set of curriculum frameworks. If you were involved back then, you might remember we were trying to answer the question, what should students know and be able to do at each grade level? Okay, and we hoped it all added up to, I think implicitly it should have all added up to college and career readiness, but there wasn't that explicit objective when our frameworks were first developed. This was the objective of the Common Core, and I'll go into that a little bit more in a minute. Now, you might ask, well, if it was the objective of the Common Core standards to define college and career readiness, how is that manifest in the standards in a general way? How does that play out? What is that college and career readiness threshold, if you will? And I tried to capture that on this slide here in terms of the English language arts / literacy standards. I would say that the threshold is characterized best by where they began the development process of the English language arts standards, and that's with what they call college and career ready standards that characterize the I think it's 4 or 5 strands of the English language arts framework. So you have these strands of reading, writing, speaking and listening, and language. Those are the strands, how the ELA frameworks are organized. And for each of those strands, there are broad college and career ready standards that anchor the grade level standards, for each of the grade levels. So that's how that plays out. And if taken together, those broad college and career ready standards and the 9 through 12 standards, the specific grade level standards for high school, that characterizes the threshold for college and career readiness in terms of that framework. Now, for mathematics, it's done a little bit differently. If you look at the high school standards in the mathematics framework, some of them have a little plus sign next to them and some of them don't, okay? The ones that don't have a plus sign next to them, taken together at the high school level, define the threshold for college readiness in mathematics. And I would say in general, if you look at those high school mathematics standards, I would say that they prepare students minimally for a college algebra course. Okay, so when we talk about college and career readiness in mathematics, we're not talking about being ready to take calculus. Okay, we're talking about being ready to take what many refer to as college algebra. Now, understandably, college algebra courses even differ from college to college, but generally speaking, this is how you can characterize the threshold in mathematics. Explain a few features about each of the frameworks. In terms of the English language arts framework, the primary problem that the English language arts framework is trying to address is that when students begin college or begin a job that requires reading technical manuals, they often find that they weren't prepared to handle complex reading material. So there's a very explicit effort in the English language arts standards to build students' ability to handle increasingly complex text. So that's one of the features of it. The second feature is that we know when you go to college, you have to write. And you have to write what I would characterize as writing to a source. It's not about making up what you did on your, in your summer vacation. It's about reading a number of different texts and being able to draw evidence from those texts to make an argument, to write an explanation, so on and so forth. These are the two, I would say, primary standards in the English language arts frameworks that address the problem of college and career readiness, not being able to handle complex text and not being able to write to a source. The other feature of the English language arts framework that I think is quite interesting is this idea that teaching literacy is just not the job of the English teacher. So there are actually standards for literacy in history and science and technical subjects. And this is going to have, I believe, huge implications for professional development for many of our high school English, math, and science teachers about how to address the literacy concerns of their students and not just leave it to the English teacher. And finally, the English language arts frameworks develop and promote this idea of research skills. And if you look at our current or our former English language arts frameworks, research was handled as a separate strand, like it was off on its own. The research standards, if you will, there isn't a separate strand for research in these new standards. Instead, the research skills and knowledge are embedded primarily in the writing standards. That's where you'll find them. Okay, so what about mathematics? Okay, so the mathematics frameworks, I would say, were designed to address the general problem that we find in this country, and that is that mathematics instruction tends to be a mile wide and an inch deep. Now, I think we made a lot of inroads in addressing that problem with our former curriculum frameworks, but there's even a more explicit intent of doing so in the new frameworks. And there were several design principles used to develop the mathematics frameworks: focus, coherence, and clarity. So when we talk about focus, we're talking about not asking our students, especially our students in early elementary grades, to focus on too many topics at one time. So you'll see, for example, there's much less emphasis on probability and statistics and data analysis in the early grades now compared to our former frameworks, and much more emphasis on things like understanding our number system, base 10, getting a strong familiarity with basic operations and fractions. So really tight focus on those particular skills. In terms of coherence, coherence has to do with how standards within a grade level connect to each other, as well as how the standards progress through the grade levels. So there was a lot of attention in the standards to make sure that they supported each other. So for example, in the third grade, when you're learning about multiplication, you're also learning about area and geometry because they go together so well, just as an example of how that works out. There's many, many examples in the math frameworks that build the coherence piece. Clarity has to do with the fact that standards can be easily misinterpreted. You know, everyone can read them differently, and so there was a lot of attention to providing a lot of detail in the description of the standards here. And I always think back when we had our original curriculum frameworks in Massachusetts back in 1996 when we developed our math standards. There was a fourth grade math standard that said students should know their basic facts. Okay, you know, what does that mean? You can see there wasn't a lot of detail there, and I learned when we were developing the MCAS tests, I went to the table of our committees that were helping develop the fourth grade math test, and they were debating, well, should we have students multiply two-digit numbers by two-digit numbers, or two-digit numbers by three-digit numbers? That group was deciding. You know, and I said, wait a minute here. If there's a problem with the frameworks, they're not specific enough, and that's when, Dave, you'll remember we developed the bridge documents, which provided more detail, because they just weren't clear enough at the time. This document is very clear. The other design principle that was used in the math framework was this idea of rigor. And I would say the way the rigor is played out is in terms of what they call standards for mathematical practice. Standards for mathematical practice are more like, I would call them proficiencies or processes, mathematical processes like precision, perseverance, understanding the underlying structure in problems, being able to use tools strategically and appropriately. The math framework pays a lot of attention to these mathematical practices. It's unlikely they're going to be assessed separately, but they will be most likely embedded in the various kinds of tasks and problems that students are presented with. And so those mathematical practice standards are very important in that way. Finally, at the high school level, it's interesting how, if you look at the Common Core and how they were developed at the high school level, the standards were written according to what are called conceptual categories. They weren't originally written into 9th grade standards, 10th grade standards, 11th grade standards, and so on and so forth, or algebra, geometry, algebra 2. They were written according to these conceptual categories, again, to address this issue of coherence. However, after the framework was done, a number of folks got together with Achieve, an organization called Achieve, and they did write high school standards that are spelled out by courses, both traditional courses as well as integrated courses. So that's a nice feature of the math framework. Okay, so those are just some high-level features of each of the frameworks, but I know many of you are sitting there going, oh my gosh, I now have to implement all this stuff. What are you going to do to help us do that? So at least as a first step, if you go to our website, the department's website, you can get what we call a side-by-side comparisons of the former and new frameworks. Some people call these crosswalks. And basically what they do is they line up the former standards with the new standards, and they say whether there's a connection there or not. So you can see where the standards are connected, either fully or partially. You can see where standards may have been moved from one grade level to another. So in some cases in mathematics, there may have been standards we had at grade 3 that were moved to grade 4 in the Common Core, or vice versa. It'll spell that out for you, and so on and so forth. So that's a very important document, I think a first step that many of you will hear from districts will want to take a look at and study closely. Okay, so let's just move on to this idea of transitioning curriculum and instruction to the new frameworks. And I have a few slides here. Again, it's just some high-level timeline and some suggestions of what you might do to begin the implementation. We envision the implementation taking several years. It's not a simple matter, and I think at some grade levels and in some subject areas it's going to be relatively easy, whereas in others it's going to be more difficult. So I know working with our staff, we saw in grade 6 math there was quite a bit of difference between our former standards and the new standards. So we believe that at the beginning in middle school mathematics there will probably be a lot of changes that need to be made. But if you can think of this year as an initial planning year, next year partially implementing the new standards, 2012, 2013, having them nearly fully implemented, if not near full implementation if you haven't implemented them all by then. So I think that just to get the ball rolling this year, I think you should be building awareness of those frameworks. You should have some study groups in your district taking a close look at them, using our crosswalks to identify what needs to change in your district and how you're going to make the changes. You know, if you don't get to make the changes, that, you know, that's understandable. The frameworks were just adopted in December. But you should, by the end of the year, be able to identify, gee, just where those changes need to be made and what do we need to do to make them. And then in the next 2 years, it's just about executing the plan that you developed to make the transition. Take a quick. So interestingly, I would say we're in a very different period of time than we were back in 1996, 1997 when we first rolled out the curriculum frameworks. At that time, the theory was, well, if the state defined the standards and then tested and held people accountable for achieving those standards, districts could fill in what's between the standards and the tests. In other words, you do all the work and do all the curriculum work and we'll sit back and let you go and do that. Well, interestingly, I think a lot of districts did a really good job in developing curriculum and instruction, but they all had to do it on their own, and some didn't do it that well. And I think even to this day, we know that instruction in our classrooms is not totally aligned, even with our former frameworks. We're in a different period now. I think we've learned a lot. And certainly with the award of our Race to the Top grant, the department's in a position to really help promote and become more involved in the development of local curriculum and instruction. We're not looking to dictate it. We're not looking to develop a one-size-fits-all curriculum, but we are interested in supporting you in by developing model units, by helping perhaps put out a model scope and sequence, by having a digital library of resources, by convening you in regional forums through our readiness centers and our district and school assistance centers and so on and so forth. So you can see there's going to be a lot of assistance and a lot of ways we bring people together so they can do this. You're not sitting in your district alone trying to do this work. I know it's easy to say, it's harder to do, because we're asking you to start moving ahead right now, and you are sitting in your district doing the work yourself. But we will be posting on our website lots of materials to help you do that work, and we will be convening you so you can form the kind of networks you need to form in order to work with each other. And I know when the panel comes up, Julia Phelps, who's with the department, director of our Curriculum and Instruction Center, will be talking a little bit more about the tools and supports we'll be providing to help people implement the new standards. I just also want to say just about everyone and his brother is into this act. You can see there's foundations and nonprofits, the U.S. Department of Education, the assessment consortia, unions. Everyone's going to be developing model curriculum. So I think there will be a lot more support for making this transition than there was in the past. Okay, when we come to MCAS, big question is, okay, when are we going to begin testing students on these new standards? And there are two overarching objectives that we're trying to meet as we make the transition MCAS to measure the new standards. And one is fairness. And as I mentioned when we started the little presentation here, we don't want to test students on material you haven't had a chance to teach them yet. That's not what we're looking to do. And two, we'd like to maintain the trend line with MCAS. And what I mean, we'd like to be able to compare last year's results to this year's results and so on and so forth. And that's not always simple when you're changing the content of what you're trying to measure. You know, there's an old adage, if you want to measure change, don't change the measure, okay? But we are changing the measure here a little bit. We're going to be testing things that were not in our former frameworks. So we're going to attempt to make the changes to MCAS sort of incremental, so we have sort of a chain effect, if you will. So it may be that you can compare MCAS in 2013 to 2012. It may not be as fair a comparison to compare 2013 back to 2011. But we're going to try to do this in a staged way so we can maintain that trend line. So the way we're going to do that, this year you all know MCAS is what it's always been. You know, it's based on our former frameworks. We didn't make any changes for this year. Next year, MCAS will focus on standards common to the former and the new frameworks. In other words, we're going to look at what's common to each of those bodies of standards and focus the test on that intersection. What's the overlap? Now, as we do that, and we look grade by grade, we know there's not going to be a robust, in some cases, the overlap may not be robust enough to just base the assessment on that. Also, if we just base it on if the set of standards is not comprehensive, we want to make sure students get a full curriculum next year. So we want to define standards that represent a full curriculum as well. So for next year, in addition to the overlap, we'll be testing some of our former standards as well. Okay? Now we're going to post probably in a few weeks exactly what standards will be tested next year and what standards will be tested in 2013. So we'll be showing you the standards that comprise the overlap, as well as the specific standards that are from our former framework that will continue to be tested. All right, so it's not going to be a secret. I'm going to let you know that probably within a month. In 2013, again, we're going to focus on that overlap, but instead of testing former standards, we're going to test some of the standards in the new framework that didn't appear in our old framework and are not in the overlap. Okay, so that's the way we're going to stage this. And then in 2014, MCAS can be based, solely on the new curriculum frameworks. All right, so that's how we're going to stage this out, and we're going to make sure that we're clear with you as to what the tests are going to cover. Okay, now just in conclusion, just looking beyond 2013, certainly by the beginning of the 2013-2014 school year, you should have your local curriculum aligned to the new standards, to the new curriculum frameworks. Nearly fully aligned in the 2012-2013 year, but on day one of 2013-2014 school year, you should be fully aligned, because MCAS will be based solely on the new curriculum frameworks in the spring of 2014. And pending its successful development, we'll be transitioning from MCAS to PARC in 2014-2015. All right, so that'll be the new assessment system beginning in the 14-15 school year. And that, just before I conclude, I just want to say that we're also while we've worked in science and math over the past couple of years, we've also been in the process of revising our science standards over this past year. And interestingly, there's not a Common Core kind of effort, that was sponsored. The Common Core standards were sponsored by the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Governors Association. Okay, so there was that effort. There is an effort that isn't necessarily sponsored by those organizations, but a number of states are coming together now to develop science standards. And that effort is being organized by Achieve, and I think it's going to begin this spring. So we've already identified folks from our staff that are going to take the work we've done on revising our science standards to the table as a number of states work together to develop science standards as well. So this is all moving so that, as Penny said, we have an opportunity now where it won't matter if you're living in Tennessee or Massachusetts or California, you're going to be held to the same standards, which I think for the nation is a good thing. So with that, I'll conclude, and thank you for coming this morning. I know it's not the Parker House, but it's a nice venue nonetheless. Okay, thank you.